evening. Welcome to Employment Law Today. This is episode 2 of my weekly talk radio show. I'm Eric Sarver, employment law, business law attorney, and founder of the law offices of Eric M. Sarver. And I'm here tonight with my guest, colleague, and friend of mine, Sean O'Rourke. Sean is a cyber-liability consultant and CFO of Combs & Company. And before I introduce Sean, I thought I would just recap a bit of a summary of this show, of what Employment Law Today is all about. And the topic of this show each week has to do with business owners who are facing some of the often overwhelming employment law and labor law challenges that comes with running a small business. And these challenges have been only magnified with the COVID-19 pandemic in place, and then the reopenings and the closings and transitions and so forth. So on my weekly show, we have guest speakers, and we have 3 main goals of the show. One is to inform you, the business owner, about employment law updates. And so I'll be starting a segment where I'll have top of the hour news articles regarding ADA compliance or paid family leave as related to the coronavirus, Families First Coronavirus Response Act, and topics of that nature. And the second goal of this podcast / radio show is to inspire businesses to take healthy risks, to get information so that you can safely navigate this pandemic and go about navigating all the employment labor laws that you may be struggling with. And lastly, we'll be having featured guests or business owners who have managed to successfully go through this pandemic, and we'll talk to them about what they've discovered and what helps them to get through each day and to follow all the different labor laws that are coming their way. So with that, I'd like to give a warm welcome to you, Sean. Welcome to the show. It's good to have you.
Thank you very much, Eric. Good to be here, and thanks again for inviting me.
Oh, my pleasure. You're welcome. I'd like to just read a brief summary about you, if I may, just to introduce you a little bit to our guests. So our guest tonight, as I mentioned, Sean, right here, Sean O'Rourke, cyber-liability consultant and CFO of Combs & Company, a company which provides comprehensive insurance coverage and benefits, including cyber-liability insurance, to businesses, individuals alike. And Sean has an interesting background. I met Sean through some various networking circles. In fact, we were just speaking about 3 hours ago on a webinar together. So it's like a Sean Eric day today.
Yeah.
And Sean actually in 2004 founded his own technology solutions and consulting firm. So he has a tech-based background, he also has a business-based background, and both of these go into his work as a cyber liability consultant. And so Sean sees his role as twofold. First is to minimize the damage that's done to small and mid-sized businesses, usually 1 to 300 employees, so many of you out there watching tonight. And then the second, and that's after a cyber event. And then the second aspect of Sean's work is to implement proactive protocols to limit a company's exposure in 3 areas: operations, legal, and reputation. So I hope I did justice there, Sean, in my intro, but that seems to sum up.
That works for me.
Okay, great. So I thought we might jump in with a question or two. I was wondering, Sean, if you could maybe compare and contrast for our viewers and listeners tonight some of the pre and post COVID-19 issues around cyber liability. Like, for example, I wondered, what are some of the most common cyber liability issues that businesses faced prior to COVID-19?
Well, I mean, some of them, they're the exact same things that they're facing post-COVID-19. And that would be obviously ransomware attacks. And for those who aren't familiar, ransomware attacks are essentially malware or a virus gets inside your system, and what it does is it encrypts your data, and then somebody basically pops a screen up on your computer and says, you owe me X number of dollars in Bitcoin, and I'll send you the unencryption key. That has been a boon business for years and had been steadily increasing over the years, and then just like a hockey stick, if you were looking at a chart, come the end of March, beginning of April of 2020, I mean, it's just zoomed almost vertically in terms of the number of ransomware attacks. And that's really because cybercrime has become basically organized crime, whether it's organized by a nation state, whether it's organized by a criminal element, or whether it's an organized group that are basically guns for hire. And you just hire them and you say, I want Eric's social security number, and then they figure out a way to get it. Or I want $1 million, and they figure out a way to get it. So that has been a reality for a number of years, and COVID just exacerbated it. One of the other areas that COVID really exacerbated were phishing or business email compromise fraud, where they essentially either compromise a legitimate email account, or they create an account that looks legitimate and they send you an email in the hopes that you will fall for the bait. And that's why they call it phishing, but with a PH. And in so doing, you may do any number of things that will either give them access to systems that you have and then data that you have, or will actually transfer money or something of value to them, thinking that you're sending it to a legitimate entity. A perfect example of this is somebody sends you an invoice and says, hey, Eric, we're your printing company, and you just printed up 1,000 flyers, and here's your invoice. Oh, by the way, we have a new bank account, and we're only accepting wires or ACH transfers, so here's the information. Well, it's not really from your printing company. They either compromised the printing company's email account and found that invoice and sent it to you and then just changed the banking info, or they created something and they're phishing for you, and then you really didn't print anything, so you know to automatically delete it, or you really did, but you're not sure with whom. Believe it or not, those situations do arise. So those elements were pre and post-COVID. Post-COVID, they've just been intensified because of something that we'll talk about in terms of post-COVID, which is the new distributed workforce scenario.
Right. It's interesting because I can see some of the potential factors, sort of the perfect storm that must have been brewing when COVID hit for anyone involved with cyber attacks, with ransomware, with phishing emails, as you stated. Interesting also to know why they spell it P-H-I-S-H-I-N-G. It's, I guess, indicative of how it's just one-off from phishing, the way missing letter or...
to be perfectly honest, I never questioned it. I just saw phishing, and at that point, I was so involved in the day-to-day of IT, I never bothered to find out. So, you know what? Maybe I'll do some research after this, and I'll send you an update.
Oh, could be good for like a Trivial Pursuit night. You know, it's good to know the information. But in all seriousness, I know this can be a very serious issue for small businesses, and I can see how the combination of, number one, you've got, like you said, the distributed workforce, people working remotely from home, people working from maybe perhaps unsecured and unsecured laptops or iPads, and their attention, I imagine, is somewhat distracted and diverted a bit, right? Because you've got some folks who have maybe their 2 or 3 children at home, young kids are being homeschooled on Zoom, or you've got a husband and wife maybe, or 2 partners who are working out of the same small space. And so I think people's nerves are kind of frayed, and we're all a little bit stretched to the end these days. And so we might not be as sharp if it's an email comes in and the email has 1 letter off. I've often, whenever I get an email, I usually check whom it's from, and especially if it has to do with money or requests for it. And I often do notice that 1 letter's off or there's a period somewhere, but I can definitely see how that trend would only escalate. It sounds like once a company, let's say, has taken the bait, and either they've opened a phishing email, or they've been hooked in that regard, or let's say they've had the ransomware attack and someone is demanding a hostage situation, give me money for the information. Company might have, or it could be a law firm, for example, with the duty to protect confidential files, looking at some very serious violations. It could be a medical office where HIPAA information is on the line and compromised. And is there a coming back from that scenario? Or what? And that's kind of a tech issue,
Sure.
but yeah, what might
Yeah,
be?
you could recover from that scenario, but it's all dependent on what you do before that happens to you. It's like
Proactive
anything.
measures.
Yeah. It's what I do now for a living. I'm not taking care of people's IT infrastructure or their security infrastructure. I'm essentially working with the business side of the house to let them know that this is a business issue now. This is not an IT issue. The
Right.
IT portion of it, I won't say takes care of itself, but the IT field has become aware of what is happening and how to respond to it. So when I go and I talk to a business owner or a CFO or somebody else who's in charge of cyber from a business side, they're always
Mhm.
like, well, the cyber response is the IT problem. And I have to educate them on the fact that no, it's not really the IT problem, because the real damage is done when the business side of the house is not prepared to respond to the inevitable, which is having a cyber incident. I can guarantee you, if you're in business long enough and you keep enough machines or devices connected to the internet, you're going to have a cyber event. There's a very famous quote: you can't defend, you can't protect, all you could do is prepare and respond.
Hmm.
Um, and so I paraphrase that. I know it's not the actual quote, but
Right.
that's the paraphrasing. So what I do now is I work with the business side to prepare them to respond. And it
Mhm.
comes to the areas that you mentioned, and there's an acronym that's developed lately called ROLW, ROLW, and that stands for reputation, operations, legal, and financial. Those are
Hmm.
the four areas that are chiefly impacted by a cyber event. And what you do as a business person, whether you're a solopreneur or you have 300 employees, what you do ahead of time will dictate how painful and how hard it is to recover from a cyber incident. And I hearken back to Equifax. Equifax is my number one go-to because it's the one everybody remembers.
Yep.
And
And
all you have to do is look at how poorly the business side responded to understand why at this point. I mean, their cost of this is in the billions, and I wouldn't be
Mhm.
surprised if it's in the tens of billions of dollars. And that's real money in lost sales, fines that you had to pay, settlement costs you had to pay, expenses you had to pay to rebuild your reputation. I
Sure.
mean, look, you see Experian all over the place. You still see TransUnion all over the place. You don't see much advertising out of Equifax. Equifax is kind of run silent, run deep, and try to build business that way without necessarily exposing themselves to the general public.
It's an interesting point, Sean. I think one area that you and I have a commonality in, or one aspect of our practices that is similar, is that the proactive measures is so key. And if you take those, it can really lessen, soften the blow, the pain, whether it's taking proactive measures to avoid a site or to respond, I should say, right? Prepare and respond to a cyber attack,
Yep.
or whether it's taking proactive measures, say, setting up a home workforce that complies with the employment labor laws so that you're not hit with a giant overtime class action suit. And
Yep.
I see we've got about a minute or less than a minute to commercial break. But when we come back, maybe we can just take a little chat, talk about some of those proactive measures, and maybe even weigh the cost so we can see what exactly, if one truly is being penny wise and pound foolish when they're not taking on cyber liability and not taking it seriously, and then how are they protecting themselves and what kind of profit might they protect if they are taking this seriously. So
Sure thing.
I think it's a great jumping off point after the break. We'll be back after this commercial break, folks. Stick around. Employment Law Today right here on talkradio.nyc.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC at
Do you love or are you intrigued about New York City and its neighborhoods? I'm Jeff Goodman, host of Rediscovering New York, a weekly show that showcases New York's history and its extraordinary neighborhoods. Every Tuesday live at 7 p.m., we focus on a particular neighborhood and explore its history, its vibe, its feel, and its energy. Tune in live every Tuesday at 7 p.m. on talkradio.nyc.
Hey, all you listeners, looking to boost your business? Why not advertise on Talk Radio NYC with very reasonable rates? Interested? Simply send us a message on our website, talkradio.nyc.
Hi, I'm Graham Dobbin. Join me every Thursday evening for the Mind Behind Leadership here on talkradio.nyc. We speak to people from business, sport, military and politics, all around what makes a great leader. The personal experiences of what's worked and, maybe more importantly, what hasn't worked. So that's 7 o'clock every Thursday evening, the Mind Behind Leadership here on talkradio.nyc. Listen to real stories of real leaders.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC. Uplift, educate, empower.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm here, like I mentioned, with Sean O'Rourke, cyber-liability consultant and CFO of Combs & Company. And for those who may be joining us late, Sean and I were just having a conversation about some of the cyber liability issues and cybersecurity issues that have been happening and escalating and on the rise during the COVID-19 pandemic. We talked a little bit about phishing, email scams, and ransomware attacks. And as Sean mentioned, these are not new necessarily, and they're not stemming or born from COVID-19, but they're on the rise with the pandemic. And we talked a bit about that, some of the causes, people working from home, people working remotely, people have their attention diverted. I think a lot of cybersecurity, or rather cybersecurity experts know this, and I think a lot of cyber criminals know this as well. I think we really left off an interesting point before the break about, I asked Sean if there were some proactive measures that a business can take. And what I found I've been practicing employment law about 21 plus years by now, and it seems that a lot of times the business will wait on something that they know they should do. They know maybe that a proactive measure is important. It's important to have, for example, your employment contracts looked at in advance. It's important to have somebody go over, let's say, your hourly employees and your unpaid and your overtime and your unpaid interns, to make sure that you're doing it correctly. Because if you're not doing that correctly and you get caught by the Department of Labor or you get sued, it's a much larger headache. I guess what I wondered, Sean, is before talking about, let's say, some of those proactive measures that I'd love to get into with you in the cyber liability world, what are some of the obstacles you've seen or hesitations you've seen, let's say, from small business owners that you've spoken with? You know, you go to them, you're maybe talking about, this is a cyber security policy we have, and this is what steps we would take and how much it would cost. And what are some of the, I don't know, hesitation type of moments that you've experienced? Maybe you can share with us.
Well, there's a lot.
How much time do we have, right?
Yeah, exactly. We'll have to have a part 2 next hour for this
top
question.
3, top 5 maybe? Is that
Yeah, so obviously the first and foremost is the money. Everybody looks at technology as a cost center when they don't realize that their entire business now runs on technology, whether it's digital communication, e-commerce, shipping, digital data. It doesn't matter. It runs on technology. It doesn't necessarily mean it runs by or you do business by technology, but it runs on technology. And they don't really conceive of the disruption that would be caused if that technology was suddenly cut off for one reason or another. It could be for nefarious reasons, or it could just be bad luck. And so they don't really get the concept of why this is a business problem and not a technology problem. And so it always comes down to money. The second one is, again, education's not the right word, but it's the word I'm going to use. It's the education of the fact that there are now laws out there, state laws,
Yes.
in all 50 states, and then California and New York have their own. South Carolina has a special one for insurance industry. Nevada has its own sort of cyber laws and whatnot, and every other state is looking at these for potential passage in 2021, 2022. And so they don't realize what they are on the hook for should they have a cyber event. And so that's why I say the business response, or the lack of preparation on the business side, is really what ends up being costly, because then you have regulators knocking at your door, and then you have plaintiffs' attorneys from the people whose data or systems were compromised because of your breach or incident. And they're knocking on your door and they're saying, you're responsible for this. And now all of a sudden everybody's like, well, I didn't know that. Well, ignorance is, as you know, is not a defense in a court of law. So even a civil court. And then the third one is inertia. They just, it takes work, and they just don't want to do the work. They have other things going on. They need to run the business, especially now with COVID disrupting so much. They're just looking at it, they're like, you know what, when I can get to it, I'll get to it. And they never get to it. It's one of those items that keeps getting pushed down the to-do list. And it's not an item that will wait for you. People out there are, whether they get you by chance or whether they get you on purpose, they're going to get you. And you are in their crosshairs. You're never too small, and you don't have the protection of saying nobody's interested in what I have. They don't care. They send out 10 million emails a day, and you receive 5 of them. They send out 100 emails of them, and you receive 50 of them. They don't care. They don't know who you are. They're just out there fishing, as I said. And they'll take what they catch.
Often, it's something they do in mass. It's sort of a mass approach of just try to get as many people as possible on the hook and see who may respond, who might have a lot of data information. I'm glad you mentioned that. And you know, it's interesting, Sean, because those 3, let's say, obstacles, shall we say, or those stalling points that where people stall out. So let's say, for example, business owners that are listening tonight to this broadcast, whether they're on Facebook Live, for Talk Radio NYC, whether they're listening to the audio recording later, I think that a lot of business can identify with those 3 things. That's the money and the education, or lack of education, say lack of true knowledge of what's at stake, and then the inertia. And I've always seen those 3 items very much, they're interconnected, they're linked, and they play into one another. So it's sort of, to me, it seems, if a business lacks the education, the knowledge of what's at stake truly, if they don't know, for example, that you're right, all these different states have passed now laws regarding the company's obligation for protection of data and privacy and data protection. There's also, of course, many laws modeled after the European, like GDPR type of rules and regulations. So if a business doesn't know exactly what they're on the hook for, if something goes awry, then the inertia kicks in, because they don't really see how serious the problem is. And once the inertia kicks in, then they look at what has to be done, and then they start to see how much it's going to cost them, or the cost contributes to the feeling of inertia, like, oh, this is going to be an expensive proposition. But I do see that a lot with employment law as well. And I think that during COVID, you know, I think people listening tonight to this broadcast, if there's any takeaways around employment law, I would stress to them is that, you know, your employees, many of them are working remotely, many are, let's say, on an unsecured laptop, or they're not in the office where something looks funny, they can bring it up to IT departments, eyes, and they're.
I'll give you an example
Yeah, please do. I'd love to hear
that
one.
works very well in your world.
Mhm.
Since the remoteness of the COVID response
Mhm.
in terms of a workforce, to your point, an IT department, whether it's internal or whether it's a gun for hire, like my old firm was, an outsourced CTO, essentially, they don't have insights into the home setup.
Mhm.
And usually, how does a company make a request that you don't let your kids on your Wi-Fi when you're working?
Mhm.
Because you don't know what your kids are downloading. How do you make a request that they don't use their own laptop because you don't know what's on the laptop or who else uses the laptop? And how do you make a request that, okay, well, let IT at least get in on the laptop, create a different account that they can further secure and monitor. And then an employee turns around and says, well, but wait, this is my personal laptop. My family's on here. If you can monitor my laptop, you can see everything that everybody's doing. I don't want that. But the company is looking at it as, well, guess what? If you're on your laptop and you're working and that laptop is compromised, we're on the hook for all the client data that gets compromised via your laptop. So why shouldn't we want to be able to monitor and control what you're doing? And I think that's a discussion that, one, hasn't gotten a lot of attention because it's a nuanced discussion, but it's conversations that are happening all over the United States, and I'm pretty sure the world, when it comes to companies having employees work from home. And it's you're better versed in the law. I only play a lawyer on these Zoom calls, so I don't know all the ins and outs, but I do know there are legal limits to what you can request at home or for employees working at home, even in the age of COVID. And while this won't be a permanent deal, I don't think, there's a lot of damage that could be done between now and everybody coming back to the office.
You read my mind, Sean. I was thinking about that in terms of companies where I update their employee handbooks and employee manuals, and I usually have them, I recommend they implement a social media policy and also a policy around the laptops that they use. Whereas if they're at work and they're working from a work laptop, they don't go onto other sites that might be non-secured sites or compromised. And usually pre-COVID, when everyone would most of the time come into the office, maybe some folks might work from home on Fridays or one day a week to save on the commute. But for the most part, people were coming in and the company could say, hey, these are our standard issue computers. Here you go. People come into their cubicle or their desk and they log on. And in terms of liability, as an attorney, I could say that as an employer, and if you're wondering about this, you do have a right to request that your employees use a secured laptop. Now, it gets tricky if it's their own private property and you're saying to them, don't let your, say, husband on the computer or your wife or your child.
Right.
And it's something that, the purchase that they bought rather, they went out to the store, they've been using this laptop, you didn't pay for it. And are they technically under the auspice of working during that time? Because let's say you're basically setting restrictions and limitations on what they can and can't do.
Right.
And that might be considered hours on the clock. So if you tell them, hey, I don't care if it's 7 p.m., 9 p.m., you work 9 to 5, but you cannot go on these sites or you cannot use your computer in this way, it's almost as if you were to send somebody an email requesting information. So that gets into a whole other issue for another time, perhaps. But what I'd love to talk about with you as well on this is that you mentioned the money, and in terms of helping our viewers, our listeners to overcome some of these stumbling blocks, I found that when people really look at these things like money, inertia, education, they're surprised at what they thought the case was and what was the reality. So maybe, I know we have a break coming up again in the commercial, but I know that I've seen when I talk to potential clients and they say, oh God, compliance, proactive measures, how much is it going to cost me? I tell them, what it costs, but then to talk about how much things might cost, let's say if they make a mistake, don't comply with the law, and let's say they're being sued for as we discussed earlier today in a webinar, a non-ADA compliant website, or maybe they're getting hit with a penalty of $75,000 if a case goes to court. So how much would it cost to make that compliant? So I would just be curious to hear maybe some of the money, and maybe after the break, a good starting point. How about you and I kind of deconstruct some of those stumbling blocks for our viewers?
Well, I'll give a teaser to bring everybody back.
Okay.
For all my gamers out there,
Hmm.
I'll give you a cheat code when you come back.
A cheat code coming up from Sean O'Rourke.
Yeah.
I like that. It's a good teaser. So we're about to take a break. Once again, you're listening to Employment Law Today. I'm Eric Sarver. This is Sean O'Rourke. We're here on talkradio.nyc. Stick around. Back in a moment, folks.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC. Uplift, educate, empower.
Are you interested in having a better relationship with yourself, others, and God? Greetings. I'm your host, Dr. George Andow, for the show A Journey Through into Awareness. On my show, we journey into the awareness that the mind of God is the true seat of our personal consciousness. We join together each Monday at 7 p.m., so tune in on Talk Radio NYC.
Are you a conscious co-creator? Are you on a quest to raise your vibration and your consciousness? I'm Sam Leibowitz, your conscious consultant. And on my show, The Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity, we will touch upon all these topics and more. Listen live at our new time on Thursdays at 12 noon Eastern Time. That's The Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity, Thursdays, 12 noon on talkradio.nyc.
Are you a curious person, always asking questions? Do you desire to be in the know? Then join me, Antonia, host of So Now You Know, Thursdays at 5 p.m. at talkradio.nyc. Listen in as I attempt to satisfy that curiosity. I will be talking with amazing, everyday people. Join the fun. So Now You Know on Thursdays at 5 p.m. at talkradio.nyc.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC at www.talkradio.nyc. Now broadcasting 24 hours a day.
Welcome back to Employment Law Today. Eric Sarver, Law Office Eric M. Sarver. I'm here with my guest tonight, Mr. Sean O'Rourke, cyber-liability consultant and CFO of Combs & Company, a comprehensive insurance and benefits company. So before the break, we had a nice teaser from Sean when I asked about, we're going to try to deconstruct for our audience tonight, and our audience being a lot of small and mid-sized business owners. Could be a new business, a solopreneur, as Sean mentioned, could be a long-established company. If you're listening tonight, if cyber liability issues have been on your back burner of your to-do list, and you've had the inertia kick in, or if cyber liability has been on the back burner for you, and you've had maybe an issue of just not knowing exactly what this cyber liability is really all about, lack of education of your obligations, or if you've thought that maybe cyber liability, cyber security, anything cyber sounds quote unquote expensive, and that may have scared you from taking action. And we have Sean here with us today, who's an expert in these fields. I thought maybe Sean could deconstruct these. So we talked a little bit about education. Sean mentioned some of the laws that are out there and some of the liability aspects. I can attest as an attorney that yes, if there's a major data breach and you had a duty to secure one's data, that person can file lawsuits, and depends upon the nature of the data. That can also be a factor if it's financial data, health insurance, health-related data. I can also state that if there's a state law in place that sets a standard that you must comply with, and you reach that standard, it makes it that much easier or I should say, could make it that much easier for a plaintiff's attorney to hold your business accountable. So Sean, in terms of the money part, the interesting teaser there, what if we had a butcher scale, and on one side of the scale we had the cost of the proactive measures, the solutions that you, let's say, recommend that you do for your clients, business owners. On the other side of the scale, we have, let's say, the cost or potential cost. I know they could be, broad range that happens when it comes to a ransomware attack or a phishing attack where the company was unprepared, the company was not proactive. What do those costs look like to you on two sides of the scale? Can you maybe share a bit about that?
Well, on the, let's use ransomware, because ransomware's got pretty definitive numbers.
Sure.
Because obviously they're all, anybody who's made it public, you know how much they had to pay.
Mm-hmm.
Small to mid-sized businesses, and this is this scale is not true to form, but small to mid-sized businesses,
Sure.
and I'm talking micro businesses, so under 10, and mid-sized businesses, I'm probably thinking under 100 people, 100 employees.
Mm-hmm.
Their average ransomwares are 4 to 5 figures. So we're talking in the thousands to tens of thousands.
That they could be on hook for, have to pay to get the data back from the
out of pocket, to get the unencryption key, just to get the data unencrypted, decrypted. Now here's the kicker. This had started back in 18, 19, 20 has really become, it's basically the de facto process now. Ransomware used to be just about encrypting the data. Well, no longer. Ransomware is now about encrypting data and exfiltration. So they're going to copy that data while it's encrypted.
That's the exfiltration part?
Yes. And they're going to take it out. And what they do is they demand a ransom for the unencryption key. And as part of that message, that they will say, whether up front or when you come back to either tell them no or to negotiate, they'll come back and they'll tell you, well, we've taken copies of all your data. And if you don't pay us the ransom, we're going to release that data. If you pay us the ransom, we promise to delete it. And so you're caught between a rock and a hard place. I mean, you mentioned it in the first segment about what lawyer obligations are when it comes to protecting attorney-client privilege and privileged information. Well, there are a number of cases out there and examples of law firms being compromised through ransomware where the data was stolen. And whether or not it was released is dependent on whether or not the law firms pay. Now, as you get over 100 employees, or you're an organization where the ransomers know you have sensitive information that you are desperate to keep out of the public eye, they jack the prices up. $1 million ransom, $1 million ransom is no longer unusual. A number of years ago, before I left the day-to-day IT, the ransomware started at $300 because it was small enough that everybody pretty much paid and nobody went to law enforcement, where nobody caused any problems for the ransomers. When you set that precedent, the ransomers then realized, okay, well, how about 500? How about 1,000? How about 10,000?
Sure.
Well, here's where actually insurance, cyber insurance, has actually caused, I think, damage, because insurance carriers are doing the calculations and they're realizing, well, if they don't pay the ransom, they're going to be down for possibly 4 to 5 days because they're not really well prepared, and they're going to have to rebuild everything. They'll have to clean everything. That's going to cost way more than just paying the ransom and then cleaning up once the data is decrypted. So just pay the ransom.
More than the ransom, more than even a five-figure ransom.
Oh, I mean, so if it's $1 million, they assume that the company can pay $1 million, which means it's a lot of data or a broad system. And it may cost significant money to repair that and bring that back to normal state. So what's happening is that the insurance carriers are saying, just pay the ransom. Where the FBI and law enforcement is saying, no, don't pay the ransom.
Right.
All you're doing is what is sort of feeding the frenzy, and it'll continue the frenzy. So it's basically like chumming the waters if you're trying to bring sharks to a tourist boat. You got to chum the waters to create the frenzy. Well, that's exactly what's happening when you pay a ransom on a ransomware attack. So in that vein, the insurance carriers are doing the math for their perspective, but they're not doing the long-term math. And I think they've been short-sighted when it comes to the costs associated with recovery from just, let's say, a ransomware attack.
Right. So they're looking maybe at the individual situation in almost a bean counter way, a situation of just counting up the money and seeing which is the cheaper option. But in the long term, what they're either maybe choosing to look away from or just not focused on is the fact that by paying the ransom, you're encouraging, and if you're enabling, you're fostering this environment where it's kind of funny. When I think of ransom, I think of the old, old-fashioned sort of the Law and Order type shows with someone being kidnapped and they never negotiate, don't pay the ransom, and
but why do that anymore? It's like I made this comparison to John Dillinger. John Dillinger had to rob innumerable banks to make $1 million. Now back then, $1 million was a lot of money, but he was in physical peril every moment of every day of his life, basically, once he became a wanted criminal. If you're a ransomware person or a hacker, nobody knows who you are, nobody knows where you are, and you can rob $100 million with no physical peril to yourself. And so it's changed the game, and I think insurance carriers have have helped create an environment where they're more brazen. They've become an organized crime syndicate in a lot of ways, and nation states are now participating in this, which just makes it all the more difficult for businesses to keep themselves safe. But let me tell you the cheat code, because I know we're going to go to break in a few minutes.
In about a minute or two, but sure.
Cyber insurance can cover a lot of your unpreparedness on the business side.
Okay.
Right now, especially in the small to mid-sized market, cyber insurance carriers or insurance carriers are offering in cyber insurance, and the majority of them are doing so, are not penalizing companies who are not prepared on the business side of the house. They will penalize you if you're not prepared on the IT or the technology side of the house, but they don't penalize you yet if you're not prepared on the business side of the house. And that's a key differentiator, because most of the expenses come from the lack of preparedness on the business side of the house. And if you want to, on the next segment, we can talk about some of those elements that cyber insurance will pay for that you may or may not prepare your company for.
I think that's a great next segment. We can talk about that, and maybe also what is a business owner to do. Let's say when on one hand they have the FBI, the law enforcement authorities, the model there, the advice is don't pay the ransom. The ransomware, and then or the cost, and then the insurance companies tell them to settle. I wonder, rather to pay it, and I wonder if they don't follow the insurance companies, say no, we're not going to pay this on principle. Will you still provide coverage? I think that's a good question. And I also want to hear after the break what you were about to say just a moment ago in terms of the business side, that the companies are no longer being penalized. So. Sean, this is all great stuff, really good information. I think our guests, rather than our listeners, I should say, listening to you as our guest would really benefit from this. So everybody stick around. We'll be back in a little while with Sean O'Rourke. Okay.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC. Uplift, educate, empower.
Are you a small business trying to navigate the COVID-19 related employment laws? Hello, I'm Eric Sarver, employment law business law attorney and host of the new radio show, Employment Law Today. On my show, we'll have guests to discuss the common employment law challenges business owners are facing during these trying times. Tune in on Tuesday evenings from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Time on talkradio.nyc.
Are you a business owner? Do you want to be a business owner? Do you work with business owners? Hi, I'm Stephen Fry, your small and medium-sized business or SMB guy, and I'm the host of the new show, Always Friday. While I love to have fun on my show, we take those Friday feelings of freedom and clarity to discuss popular topics on the minds of SMBs today. Please join me and my various special guests on Friday at 11 a.m. on talkradio.nyc.
Do you run or are ready to open your own business? Hi, I'm Jeremiah Fox. I've been operating and opening small business for the last 25 years, and I'm the host of the new show, The Entrepreneurial Web. Tune in every Friday at noon Eastern Time for insights and stories on the nuances of running small business right here on Fridays at noon, talkradio.nyc.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC at www.talkradio.nyc. Now broadcasting 24 hours a day.
Welcome back, folks. We're here with Sean O'Rourke, cyber-liability consultant and CFO of Combs & Company. Sean, thanks again for being on the show tonight.
I appreciate it, Eric. Thanks.
Sure. You know, I think you have really good timing and rhythm, I must say, in terms of segues and wrapping up topics going to the next one. So I did
Well, I see the note about the break, so I try to time it.
True.
That is
true. Yeah, that is true. But to be fair, but you still have a good knack for it. I just want to backtrack for a moment, not to throw you off the topic about the cyber insurance and about companies no longer penalizing, but just in terms of that money piece, right? Talked about if you had to say take a butcher's scale, and on one side we talked about the money, the cost of an eventual cyber attack, ransomware, hacking, what have you, phishing email, compromised data, and we talked about that can end up in the tens of thousands of dollars at some point, possibly more. And we talked about, pardon me, the cost, but just to clarify for our viewers, the cost of, let's say, a good cyber insurance policy.
Oh, yeah.
You'd be spending right there, because let's say they come to you for a solution and you're trying to help them, and that might be a good segue into what your company do for businesses that come to you to say, Sean, I heard you on the show, I heard what you were saying, I don't want to be unprepared for a cyber attack.
Yep.
What sort of solutions do you have? What do you do for me? Maybe we can, can you get into that a little bit?
Yep. So a cyber insurance policy is just like any other commercial insurance policy, like general liability, professional liability. You fill out an application. Mm-hmm. It gets taken to carriers, depending on who you go to. And I'll explain our role in a second. And then insurance carriers, basically, they weigh your risk. And they decide whether or not you're worth the risk. If they decide you're worth the risk, then they assign a number, a dollar figure to that risk for 12 months. And that's your premium. Obviously, that takes into account whatever your deductible is and how much the coverage is going to be, so on and so forth. So at Combs & Company, we're an insurance brokerage and consultancy. So the brokerage means that we work for our clients, because we basically go to every carrier that we can and find the best coverage at the best premium. So we're not always looking for the cheapest premium. Obviously we could do that, but that's not our role. Our role is to make sure that if you have some sort of event that requires a claim, that claim is going to be covered. And then we do what we can to put you in a position to where the claim won't be denied, and that's through the application process, making sure that the carrier is aware what you do, what you have, and how you operate. The consultancy side is broken into 3 lines, and I'll just go through those real quick. We do expert witness work for medical malpractice lawsuits. We do individual health insurance consulting. So basically we help individuals find health insurance. on the various exchanges. And then there's my department, which is cyber, and that's what we've been talking about. After 20 years of trying to keep the bad guys out, in my opinion, there's no way to do it. So I try to prepare the companies to be hacked. And people look at me really weird when I tell them that, and they're like, "Wait, aren't you supposed to stop it?" And I'm like, "No, you can't stop it. It's like water. If the water wants to get in, it'll find its way in eventually." And that's kind of the ways the cyber world is now.
Right. And the water analogy, the water getting in, let's say, to a place, that you can take the valuables and take them off the floor and put them on higher shelves. You can perhaps have some kind of insulation, and some kind of sump pump put in. So it's interesting the way you describe that in terms of the liability insurance. So in terms of how do companies, you say they weigh the risk? I'm not a cyber liability expert by any stretch, but I'm just wondering aloud to myself if that would that involve looking at the nature of the data or the number of employees who has access to the data? What type of...
So as somebody who used to live and breathe technology, I have a real problem with most cyber liability applications because they don't ask the questions that I think need to be asked.
Okay.
If I was an insurance carrier, if I was at an insurance carrier, I would basically gut most cyber insurance applications and rebuild them. But basically what they ask is, how many records do you have? And when they say records, I mean, each social security number is considered a record. Each driver's license number is considered a record. Each credit card number is considered a record. So you have to aggregate all that into a number, and then you give that. They ask about your cybersecurity. Do you have a firewall? Do you have antivirus? Is your data encrypted? Is it encrypted at rest? Is it encrypted in transit? Do you process credit cards? Are you PCI compliant, which is credit card processing? Are you HIPAA compliant, which is medical records?
Sure.
Are you GDPR compliant, which is the European Union's compliance? Are you CCPA compliant now, California's new Consumer Privacy Act? So there are questions on there. What happens though is that you say no to being compliant when you should. There's no penalty really at the moment. The market is a little oversaturated with carriers offering cyber insurance, so the premiums are artificially low at the moment. And that's why I try to convince people to get cyber insurance now, because the premiums have started to rise, and they will definitely go up next year. And once the insurance industry sort of discovers all the fallout of what happened during 2020. And so better to get in at a lower number and have it go high than to get in at a higher number and have it go higher.
Right.
And so, but what I had said before is that you're going to pay, I mean, everybody's unique. I can't give you a definitive number, but I will tell you this. We're paying an obscenely low premium for Combs and Company. Based on what I consider us, how I consider us to be a potential target. Now, we don't carry a lot of sensitive information. That's just not what we house, but we carry enough. Now, I just did a lawyer, a solopreneur.
Cyber insurance, that is? You mean, you say you did, got them?
Yeah, I got her a cyber insurance policy, sorry. And she's paying $1,100 for the year. And she's got a lot of sensitive information.
For the year, you said?
For the year, for 12 months.
Wow.
I did, there's a medical billing client of ours. They have ridiculous amounts of sensitive information, and the way they access it would keep me up at night as if I was their IT folks. And they're paying $3,500 a year for a $5 million policy, which I thought was going to be around $8,000 to $10,000, and they're paying $3,500. So it's like inexpensive, relatively speaking.
So I guess what I hear from you, Sean, is that you and Combs and Company, not only you help clients get affordable policies, but it's not as if the cheapest policy is the main thing you're after. You're after them. It sounds like you're trying to get them.
You've got to have the right coverage. You've
Right,
got to have the right coverage.
Right. Recognizing that each company, I mean, I think that you've shown on the show today just the wealth of knowledge you have around these issues. I mean, just, from what you've described, it's refreshing too, because I think as professionals, we have an obligation, I think, to remind clients and prospective clients that the cheapest isn't always the best, and that sometimes you need to pay a bit more. And then, of course, there are factors that come into play in terms of conditions and quality and such. So, I hear that you try to fit your clients with the best policies. And is that that's part of the whole preparing to be hacked? You have the policy in place, and so then the person does get hacked and they rely on the policy. And
any of my consulting clients, I require them to have cyber insurance. They don't have to buy it through Combs and Company. They can go through their existing broker or insurance carrier, but they have to have it. It doesn't make sense to go through all that I'm going to put them through, and then they still pay out of pocket when they get hit. The insurance is going to cover a lot of the damage, financial damage, legal damage, and the such. And that's what I said before on the one teaser. It covers a lot of that inertia work that you won't do.
And Sean, sorry to interrupt you. I know we're down to about a minute. I want to make sure you have a chance to give our audience your contact information. Maybe if you have a brief, how many might be able to reach you if they have a question, they want to get cyber insurance. And
sure. I mean, you can look me up on LinkedIn, Sean O'Rourke. And then if you want to reach out to me, I'm S. O'Rourke at combsandco.com, or you could just go to the website, Combs, COMBS, ANDCO.com.
Right. Okay. It's been great having you on the show tonight, Sean.
Thanks, Eric. This was a lot of fun. This is my first live broadcast, so it was good.
Our second live broadcast today. I mentioned how we were on an earlier seminar for the Queen's Chamber of Commerce discussing ADA compliance websites. Sean was the moderator. I was one of the guests, not the main guest, but a contributing. So we sort of flipped the roles a bit here right now.
Yeah, exactly.
It's been great to talk with you, Sean. Thanks again for being on the show. And we're, I think, right about at the hour. It always goes so quickly going into it. I think you've covered some main issues there. You've given your contact information. I'd say if anyone has any follow-up questions, you can always reach out to me at EMS. That's Eric, E as in Eric, M as in Mitchell, S as in Sarver at ericsarver.com. Or as Sean mentioned, you can go to his email, S O'Rourke, is it? At combsandcompany.com.
Yep.
So that's our episode tonight, folks, for the Employment Law Today, episode 2 on cyber security, cyber insurance, and cyber liability. A very pressing issue, especially now in the time of COVID-19. So if you're a small business, stay hopeful, stay inspired, don't give up. There's lots of resources, as you've heard. I'll be announcing next week's guest in upcoming social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter posts, and on Talk Radio NYC. So once again, I'm Eric Sarver. I'm from the law office, Eric M. Sarver. I practice employment law and business law for small to mid-sized companies. And tune in next week for episode 3 of Employment Law Today. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and thank you, Sean.
Thanks, Eric.